Last lesson we began to examine the effects of the so-called new media. This is the new digital form of media, which is defined by the Internet, Web 2.0, user-generated content, and the more digital-based forms of media. We also began to look at some perspectives on this new media, some possible benefits, and some effects that this might have. But today we're going to expand this and look into whether the new digital forms of media are a radical benefit to our lives, or whether in fact they are just new ways invented to indoctrinate and oppress the masses. So the purpose of this video is to basically break down the content of the lesson in a way that's slightly more engaging than maybe talking over a PowerPoint or something. With this, feel free to pause, play back parts, make sure you've got some time to take notes. So with this you can kind of really go at your own pace. So I think this is quite a useful tool for doing stuff online. So this lesson is going to be broken down into two main parts then. Think of it as like a two-part lesson. The first part of this video is going to be focused on the two main debates and the two main perspectives on the role and the advantages of new media. We'll go on to that in the first part, but then we'll go into the second half and look at the concept of moral panics. What is a moral panic? What are the effects of a moral panic? Now, a lot of this you would have done already with your other teacher possibly, but we're going to go into some greater depth, give us some more examples and apply it to media specifically. The Neophiliac perspective of new media argues that it is beneficial to society for a number of reasons. The main ones are that first, it increases our consumer choice. Secondly, it has launched an e-commerce revolution. Third, that it revitalizes democracy. So if we look at this increased consumer choice, what does this actually mean? Well, when you think about it, there's actually hundreds of choices available to you in terms of what media you consume, but also how it's delivered to you. And it's argued that this vast amount of choice that we have actually increases the quality, as all of these different media outlets have to then compete to get your attention. For example, if you think of the different streaming services and how they all try to compete with each other by securing that next best program that the others don't have. So this allows for an increased competition and therefore an increased quality of media. So next, let's look at this new concept of the e-commerce revolution and what it actually means. So e-commerce essentially means any kind of internet-based retail or purchasing. And again, the amount of opportunities that we have here is enormous in terms of where we can buy things, but also what we can buy there. There are many kind of niche goods available to you on many websites. Yes, a lot of it does tend to be complete rubbish, but any kind of want or very specific item or service that you want to consume, you will almost definitely find it somewhere on the internet. And think of the amount of opportunity that that then gives people. So the third main benefit then is that it revitalizes democracy. And when you stop to think about it, the internet is now a huge part of our democratic process in terms of our elections and our political system. Because it's almost all the time now that we're seeing discussions of politics based on social media. It's now like our public forum, basically, for discussing politics and engaging with democracy. So all of these new media technologies, especially social media, allow people to acquire better education, better information, and they can also organise and take part in a more active role in democracy. No longer are we simply kind of confined to public demonstrations in the actual real world, but now we can organise and demonstrate in a more internet-based way. But also the internet can allow for organisation of real-world protests. A number of examples that you could include in any essay would be the kind of more modern political movements like Extinction Rebellion or Black Lives Matter. If you take the Black Lives Matter example, the horrible footage of the George Floyd case was spread around and went viral through the internet. And a lot of that was down to Black Lives Matter activists engaging and trying to make a campaign for racial justice. So in summary, the Neophiliac Perspective argues that the internet and the new media has really revolutionised the way that we consume media, but also it's touched many other aspects of our day-to-day life as well. Take, for example, this e-commerce revolution and this access to all of this kind of niche markets and all of these goods that are now available to us on the internet. You know, I've just been doing a few searches, and you'll often find on Facebook, or if you're just kind of going through the internet, the most kind of bizarre goods that you would never expect anyone to want. You know, there's Viking and Saxon Armour.com, where I can buy personally made, you know, Dark Ages armour for myself. Now that's incredibly niche, and a company or a good like that wouldn't survive in a pre-internet economy, because you wouldn't know if someone was going to purchase it. But the internet allows you to basically get your customer first and then make the item, because they'll come to you for the good rather than you having to kind of market yourself constantly, and to basically make things en masse and just push them out to as many people as you possibly can. That is now quite an outdated model because of the internet, and it means that we have access now to a huge variety of different goods and services that we wouldn't have otherwise had the chance to indulge in. But also that this concept of consumer choice, many people would argue that the internet has basically taken away the barrier to entry for a lot of media. Whereas you used to have loads of money and loads of investors to get into media or to even start a company, with the internet now, that kind of barrier to entry has gone, because now all you need essentially is an internet connection and some kind of platform with which to access it, like a computer or a laptop. So in actual fact, the benefits are quite strong, but the cultural pessimists, as we're going to go on to, would argue that this is a very optimistic way of looking at the internet, and it really exaggerates a lot of the positives. So broadly speaking, cultural pessimists will argue that this so-called revolution that's happened with new media has been vastly exaggerated by neophiliacs. There are a number of studies which kind of make this argument. One of them comes from Cornford and Robbins, who argue that actually this new media is not so new, because actually it's more of an accommodation between old media and new, almost like a transitional phase, if you like. For example, if you want to use a games console to play a video game, you still require an element of old media, which would be the television. But also, much has been made about the interactivity of new media and how it's this brand new revolutionary aspect. But in actual fact, when you stop to think about it, old media has always had an element of interactivity with it, because people have always written into newspapers to address letters to the editor. They've always phoned in to radio and television shows for many years. So Cornford and Robbins argue that the new media is not necessarily as revolutionary or as new as neophiliacs would point out. It's just a kind of an evolution rather than a revolution. Cultural pessimists will also argue that this big commercialization and e-commerce revolution that's taken place on the internet has brought a lot of problems with it as well as benefits. For example, many companies that sell products and services on the internet are also engaged in quite sophisticated tracking and surveillance of their customers. Every website that engages in some kind of e-commerce will often have tracking cookies that they then use to monitor your behavior on the site so they can target better advertising to you and to try and basically use that information to get you to buy more stuff. Also, think about all of these smart devices that now infiltrate our house and how they could potentially be used to actually monitor and track your behaviors in a way that can then be used to actually get you to buy more stuff through targeted advertising. But also, when we take this concept of revitalizing democracy, a lot of this can also be slightly overstated according to cultural pessimists. Hill and Hughes in the late 1990s challenged the view that cyberspace and the internet was this safe haven for radical democratic action and real kind of discussion and debate. They argued that actually many of the alternative minority political issues or political views tended to be sidelined in the internet as much as it was in real life, because they found that 78% of political opinions expressed on particularly American websites were mainstream, as in not radically different from what was taking place on the real world political discussion. But even worse than that, Murdoch and May argue that the new media can actually be used to solidify the control of the state rather than open democracy. The strongest example of this is China, which strongly regulates social media in a way that censors any hostile information to the government or any kind of debate which threatens their supremacy. And they do this in a very clever way because they allow for their own social media sites to operate, the ones that they can remove people from who dare question the opinion of the government, but ban any outside social media influences who they wouldn't have that control over. Just listen to this Chinese government-backed censor talk about how he reacted to a local protest.
印象比较深刻的其实是某个地区政府打算修建垃圾焚烧发电站，就在城市的附近。然后可能因为一些沟通的问题，就是大家群众存在一些不满，所以大家就会有一些那个聚众示威的这个行为。然后当时我们发现了以后，以那个事故的发生点为中心，画了一个在 GPS 上面画了一个圈，10公里，10公里范围内所有的用户不能直播，然后就把整个这个事情给防控住了。重大的社会事件期间，你说19大，整个具有舆论动员能力的互联网的平台，微信、QQ、微博，国家有一套规划的机制，就你必须按照这个机制来做。
So to simplify it then, we have on one hand the Neophiliac Perspective, which broadly says that the new media is positive for a number of reasons. We have to make sure that in any exam we are able to explain what those reasons are and provide examples. On the other hand then, we've got the cultural pessimist perspective that says that it's broadly negative. And again, we have to be able to use these studies and we have to be able to give examples of why they say it's negative, or at least could be potentially negative, or just is not as good as what other people would say that it's going to be. So that's the broad kind of first half done of this lesson. The second half, we're going to start looking at the concept of moral panics, what their effects are, why they happen in terms of the media. It's important to understand why the media over-exaggerates certain stories. We have to be able to explain that in any essay. So you have to just remember that the media's main incentive is to get people to consume it. That's, you want people to read your paper, you want people to watch your TV program, or whatever the case may be. So if you are a news organisation, it's in your interest to over-sensationalise things, to over-report things, to make things seem bigger than they actually are. And moral panics are the effect of all of that sensationalism. A big concept in the sociology of media is the concept of moral panics. A moral panic is a large-scale reporting of a phenomenon which is seen to be a threat to the moral integrity of the society. It's normally referred to as a period of mass over-reporting by the media on a specific set of circumstances. The most prominent study and example of this was Cohen's study on the mods and rockers in the 1960s. In his book Folk Devils and Moral Panics, he claimed that the media over-reported a set of fights between two subcultures.
The rockers at least had the decency to look like rebels. The mods, on the other hand, were much more disconcerting. They were hooligans who dressed smarter than their parents.
Now, these two subcultures essentially had a few minor scuffles on seaside towns during the bank holidays of 1964. The media blew it way out of proportion, basically creating a story out of something which is very, very minor, but then later turning it into something far more significant. Because the media reaction meant that the police responded to any minor conflict far more forcefully, and therefore created further conflicts. But also, people involved had read stories about themselves in the media and began to feel like that was the part that they had to play, the part that was written for them by the media. And also, other people wanted to join in to have their 5 minutes of fame. People were essentially creating violence and conflict just so they could get onto the camera. When the media creates more deviance by reporting on deviance, we call this deviancy amplification, or amplifying deviance. It starts with a small scale reporting on one small phenomenon, and then it ends up creating even more of that deviance. Another example of this media moral panic creating more deviance comes from Forbear, who actually argued that there was a moral panic over the banning of hoodies at this Bluewater shopping centre in Kent. The shopping centre started to associate hoodies with criminality, so they banned hoodies. The problem was that then led to more people in the area actually wanting to buy hoodies, because it began to actually give the hoodie this slightly edgy connotation to it. And so a lot of people who wanted to build that kind of image started buying hoodies. And it also just was blown way out of proportion. It was one shopping centre that banned it, but soon there were headlines all over the country about, hoodied thugs and the danger of hoodied youth.
Prior to the Bluewater case, there were virtually no headlines with the word hoodie in them. Within a week of the Bluewater case, there were headlines in virtually every newspaper.
Soon it wasn't just shopping centres banning them.
We had the example of a 4-year-old who was banned from a sweet shop. We had a 40-year-old woman who was a nurse, was banned from a shop that she'd been going into since she was a child.
Back in Bluewater, one garment was proving very popular.
The sales of hooded tops in many of the clothes stores in the Bluewater shopping centre actually went up.
The important thing to remember with these moral panics is that it kind of creates more deviance for two reasons. First, it creates more deviance because you have this self-fulfilling prophecy, and essentially like labelling theory. People want to actually kind of build on that edgy label or that criminal or deviant label, like with the mods, the rockers, the hoodies in Forbear's study. But also, people are more sensitive to that particular deviance. So if the media is going crazy about one particular form of deviance, everyone is super on the lookout for that. So another study that you can use for this is Pearson in the 1980s. He talked about hooligans and how effectively the media turned some small-scale scuffles at football matches into this large-scale craze of hooliganism. Suddenly, these very small events, like these two football fans overturned a ice cream cart, and this made national news because suddenly it's got a tag, it's got a label that can be attached to it, the label of hooliganism. And all of this is just made to sell papers. you know, the media doesn't want to make a kind of nuanced or dry set of headlines or an argument. What they want to do is try and entice people in with kind of quite snappy headlines. And this can often end up with very sensationalized articles, and this is what helps create that moral panic. It's important to note, though, that moral panics and their effects are not uncontended by sociologists. Many people would criticise them on a number of levels. Some people might say that the media actually gives proportionate responses to many things, or they would say that it doesn't have the same kind of effect that it either used to or it just never has had that sort of effect. One criticism is that Cohen's formulation of moral panic theory assumes that the audience are passive, that they will accept anything uncritically from the media. So, similar to the opinion that many would have of the Marxist view of the media, many people would say this of Cohen and interactionism. But also, we have a study from Thornton in 1995. He found that the media actually failed to generate a moral panic over the emerging rave culture, mainly because youth culture had become so mainstream in mass media that it didn't really kind of create much of a fuss or a moral panic as the mods and rockers did in the 1960s, even though there were many deviant acts related to rave culture, like taking drugs such as ecstasy. And another couple of criticisms are that actually people are so saturated with media today that we sort of assume that the media exaggerates the deviance of many groups and crimes. So actually we are so desensitized to the effects of moral panics today that it doesn't have the same effect as it once did. But also we have to acknowledge that some concerns which many sociologists would call moral panics are actually just proportionate responses to very legitimate threats to society. So there are a great deal of moral panics at the moment, for example, over child abuse or rising knife crime. And really, are those not just legitimate concerns that people should be worried about? And we have to remember that moral panics come from interactionist theory. And the problem is that, just like interactionism as a whole, moral panic theory doesn't really explain why people would make the action in the first place. It only explains the reaction from the media. So take the mods and rockers, for example. Cohen studied the media's reaction to the mods and rockers, but didn't really explain why people were joining the mods and rockers in the first place, or why they did start many fights between each other in that first instance. He only explains the reaction. Okay, so I hope you found this at least slightly useful and have managed to get a good solid amount of notes from the content in this video. Make sure before you kind of finish up that you've got all of the content, the kind of studies and whatever that I've said, all of the main points. Also note down some examples, make sure you've got examples of each of the points, because again we need to remember that this is all for an essay, this is all for writing an exam paper in you know, just under 2 years' time. And in that you must make sure you've got evidence and you've got examples of all of the points that you've got. So what now then? So now I want you to take all of this, go and read the couple of handouts that I've put on Teams. I would have probably talked you through this anyway, but go off and read those two things just to kind of add some extra detail to those notes you've already got. Then use all of that, go off and just complete that assessment quiz for me so I can monitor how well you've understood this. And if you have any questions, you just throw them my way. So don't worry if you maybe struggled with a couple of the quite complex things that I've mentioned in the video. I'm quite happy just to be pinged a message on Teams and just, you know, answer a question on the content. So and then we'll reconvene after you've done the quiz.